Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The door that never opened. Jenna had always found comfort in the old house she had inherited from her grandparents. The creaking floors, the musty smell, the way the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, it all reminded her of childhood visits. She never imagined that the house, which had always been a place of nostalgia, would soon become a prison of her deepest fears. The first sign something was wrong came one late evening while she was cleaning the basement. Jenna had always avoided going down there, her grandparents' warnings about the damp, the cobwebs, and the thing in the basement lingering in her mind. But now, with the house empty and only herself to care for it, she had to face it. The basement door was old, creaky, and locked with an iron bolt, something she hadn't noticed before. Jenna thought nothing of it at first, but as she looked at the rusted bolt, a strange feeling began to settle in her chest. It was as if the door was meant to be shut. Something was keeping it closed. It wasn't just the lock, but the weight of the door, like it was holding something inside. But she didn't have time for superstition. The house needed attention. So, taking a deep breath, Jenna pulled open the door. A blast of cold air hit her in the face, making her shiver. She stepped into the basement, the light from the single bulb above casting weak shadows on the damp walls. The room was full of old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the faint smell of mildew. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something odd. There was a distinct feeling of movement in the air, like something unseen was stirring. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Jenna pushed the feeling aside. She moved towards a stack of old boxes and began to sort through them, brushing aside dust and cobwebs. But the more she worked, the more she felt the eyes, watching her. It wasn't until she picked up an old chest that she saw it. A strange, thick black rope lying on the floor, coiled neatly in front of her. It wasn't a rope she recognized. It didn't belong to her grandparents, who had never been the type to leave strange items lying around. She bent down to touch it. As soon as her fingers brushed the coarse fibers, a sudden scraping sound echoed from deep within the basement. It was low and guttural, like claws dragging across concrete. Her heart jumped into her throat. She quickly stood up and looked around, but the basement was silent again. She tried to shake off the unease and return to her task. But then, the scraping came again, closer, louder. She froze, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the basement. There, in the dim light, something shifted. Jenna could make out the faintest outline of something tall and thin, standing in the shadows near the far corner of the basement. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, the way it loomed still and silent. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No answer. Only silence, followed by that scraping noise again. It was as if whatever was in the corner was moving, dragging itself closer. Without thinking, Jenna backed away toward the stairs, her hands trembling. She was about to turn and run when the light above her flickered, casting everything into darkness. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, behind her. Spinning around, Jenna saw it. The thing in the basement was no longer in the corner. It had moved forward, closer to her, a tall, black silhouette that was no longer standing still. It was slowly dragging itself toward her, its movement jerky, unnatural. Jenna screamed, stumbling backward, her feet tripping over the uneven stairs as she scrambled toward the exit. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut in her face, as though it was being held shut by some invisible force. Thud. Her hand gripped the doorknob. She turned it frantically, pulling, pushing, but the door wouldn't budge. The thing behind her was close now, its breathing harsh and ragged. It was no longer dragging itself along the floor. It was standing upright, towering over her, its face obscured by the darkness. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and then, in the quiet that followed, she heard the voice. A whisper, cold and venomous. You opened the door, and then everything went black. The thing beneath the stairs. Tom had always been a practical man, the kind of person who dismissed ghost stories, horror movies, and anything that couldn't be explained away by logic. So, when he moved into the old house at the edge of town, he didn't think twice about its history. Sure, the house had stood vacant for years, and yes, there were rumors about strange happenings in the basement. But Tom was certain it was just the overactive imaginations of the neighbors. After all, nothing could be worse than the memories of the apartment building he'd left behind. But as soon as Tom stepped into the basement for the first time, he felt it, a chill in the air that made his skin prickle. He dismissed it as a draft, or perhaps the old stone foundation causing the temperature to drop. But as he stood in the doorway, he couldn't help but notice something strange about the space. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dust. But in the far corner, near the stairs, was a large, wooden chest. The chest was old, much older than anything else in the room, and it seemed out of place. Tom couldn't resist. He walked over and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. He leaned in closer, his hand gripping the edge of the chest as he tried to peer inside. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something scraping against the floor. Tom straightened up quickly, looking around the basement, but everything was still. The sound stopped as soon as it began, and he chalked it up to his imagination. After all, the house was old, and old houses made strange noises. Still, something about the chest unsettled him. He closed it and locked it. That night, after settling into bed, Tom thought he could finally relax. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet he hadn't experienced in months. But just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it. The scraping. It was faint at first, distant, but it was unmistakable. Tom's heart began to race. The sound was coming from the basement, just beneath his feet. He lay there, frozen, listening. The scraping sound continued, followed by the soft, dragging sound of something moving across the floor. And then, a whisper. Tom. His stomach twisted in fear. He had no idea why or how, but he knew that voice wasn't his own. It was deep, raspy, distorted, and it was calling his name from the basement. Tom pulled the covers tightly around him, trying to shut out the noise, but it was impossible. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, more insistent. Tom, help me. Tom forced himself to sit up. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. He could feel the sweat running down his back. What was in the basement? What was making those sounds? He tried to dismiss it. He had to. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, the stress of the move, maybe a rat or some old pipes. But the voice, it sounded too real, too close. Against his better judgment, Tom got out of bed. His legs were unsteady as he made his way to the door, the floor creaking under his feet. Slowly, he descended the stairs, the faint light from the hallway casting long shadows in front of him. When he reached the basement door, he paused. His hand hovered over the knob, his heart thundering in his chest. He could still hear it, the scraping, the whispering. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. He opened the door. The basement was darker than he remembered. The shadows seemed to swallow the space, and the smell of old wood and mildew hung thick in the air. Tom's eyes darted around the room. The chest was in the corner, just as he had left it, but there was something different now. Something was moving in the darkness. His eyes locked onto the stairs leading down deeper into the basement. The steps were covered in dust, but in the dim light, he could see something on them. A hand. It was pale, unnaturally so, and it was dragging itself slowly across the floor, reaching upward as if trying to pull someone, towards it. Tom's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He watched as the hand pulled itself up the stairs, dragging a thin, twisted arm behind it. Then came the rest of it. The thing in the basement. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, dragging its broken body across the floor. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as though its neck had snapped, and its eyes, empty, dark, void-like, fixed on Tom, locking with his gaze. "Tom!" The voice rasped again, this time from its broken mouth. Tom turned and fled. He could hear the thing behind him, dragging itself closer, its scraping sound echoing in his ears. He reached the top of the stairs, but before he could reach the door, the lights went out. The room plunged into complete darkness. His pulse raced, but he kept running, not daring to look behind him. He fumbled for the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the basement, the whisper returned. "I'm here, Tom. I'm waiting for you." The thing that lives below. Alec had always been the type to question everything. He wasn't a skeptic, but he believed in looking for logical explanations first. That's why, when he bought the old Victorian house on the edge of town, he didn't think twice about the rumors. Sure, people whispered about the thing in the basement, but people always talked. He didn't believe in ghosts or any other nonsense. But Alec couldn't deny the feeling that something was wrong. He hadn't planned on moving into the house so quickly, but when the price was right, he couldn't resist. The house was grand, with high ceilings, large windows, and an old-world charm that was hard to come by. But from the moment he stepped inside, the house felt different. It wasn't just the creaking floors or the overgrown yard. It was something else, something he couldn't name. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Alec went to the basement to fetch a box he had left behind during the move. The door to the basement was heavy, with an old brass knob that seemed to have been untouched for years. When he twisted it, the door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the house, as though the very foundations were groaning. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. Alec fumbled for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and hummed weakly. The room was filled with old furniture, boxes of things he hadn't bothered to sort through yet, and piles of unused junk. Nothing out of the ordinary, but there was something there, something strange. Alec couldn't quite place it, but as he stepped further into the basement, the feeling of being watched washed over him. He turned, expecting to see a shadow or the movement of something behind him, but there was nothing. It was then that he noticed the sound. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft tapping, like something was gently hitting the floor. Alec dismissed it as a house settling, but as he moved deeper into the basement, the tapping grew louder, more rhythmic. His eyes darted around the room, but everything remained still. Then, a whisper. "Alec!" His blood ran cold. He spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. The tapping had stopped, and the whispering faded as if it had never happened. But Alec knew. He knew something was down there with him. He shook his head, trying to clear the feeling of panic clawing at his throat. It was just an old house. His mind was playing tricks on him. But then the tapping started again. This time, it was different. It was louder. It was faster. Suddenly, Alec felt a rush of cold air brush against his skin. He turned to see a shadow move swiftly across the back wall of the basement, too fast for a human. The hair on his arms stood up as he instinctively took a step back, his pulse quickening. Then the whisper came again. "Alec, come closer." His heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't in his head. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was calling to him. Without thinking, Alec took a step forward, his legs moving of their own accord. He felt like he was being drawn to something, pulled by an invisible force. The shadows in the basement seemed to grow darker, swirling around him like a living thing. The tapping was louder now, almost like footsteps, heavy, dragging. It was coming from below him. His eyes darted to the floor, and his breath caught in his throat. There was a crack in the floorboards, wide enough to see through. Alec bent down, peering into the darkness below. And there it was. A pale, twisted hand emerged from the crack, fingers long and gnarled. It reached up, scraping the wood with nails that were sharp, too sharp for anything human. Alec froze, his chest tightening as the thing below the floor began to pull itself up. The hand was joined by another, then an arm, and then a head. A face that was more shadow than substance. Its eyes wide and black, empty voids staring up at him. Alec stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing was getting closer, its body writhing out of the hole in the floor, crawling toward him. He turned and ran, the basement door slamming shut behind him with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. He was breathless, panicked, his mind struggling to process what he had seen. But as he rushed upstairs, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The whispering. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from everywhere. "Alec, you can't escape me." The voice was no longer distant. It was right next to him, behind him, inside the walls. The house was alive, breathing, shifting. He glanced over his shoulder as he reached the top of the stairs. There, standing in the doorway of the basement, was the thing, no longer crawling, but standing tall, towering over him. Its face was no longer just shadows. It was a grotesque mask of twisted flesh, its mouth open wide, stretching too far, too impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that were far too sharp. It spoke, its voice now a low, rasping growl. "You opened the door, Alec. Now you're mine." The voice beneath the floorboards. Emma had always loved old houses. There was something captivating about them. The creaking floorboards, the dust-filled air, the sense of history in every room. When she and her husband, Josh, moved into the old farmhouse in the countryside, she was thrilled. The house was perfect, just what they had been looking for. A fixer-upper with character, a place to settle down and start their family. But from the moment they stepped inside, there was something off. Something Emma couldn't quite put her finger on. The house was quiet, too quiet. The floorboards seemed to groan under her weight even when she was the only one walking. At night, she would hear strange sounds, a tapping from somewhere beneath the floors, a faint scratching from the walls. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps animals scurrying in the walls. But as the days passed, the noises grew more persistent. Josh didn't hear it, though. He was always busy with work, focusing on getting the house in shape. But Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratching. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, faint but growing louder. Emma's heart began to race. She glanced at Josh, who was asleep beside her, oblivious to the sound that had started again. The scratching continued, followed by something else, soft, shuffling footsteps. She felt a cold chill creep up her spine. The footsteps moved closer, as if something or someone was crawling beneath the floor. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence in the room was deafening. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she sat up in bed, straining her ears to hear anything. Any movement, any sound. Then came the voice. A whisper. "Emma." The voice was low and raspy, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, faint but clear. Emma's blood ran cold. She turned to Josh again, but he remained sound asleep, oblivious to the terrifying voice coming from the floor beneath them. "Emma, you have to listen." The voice was closer now, almost as if it was right beneath the bed. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was down there. She could feel it. She could feel its presence, crawling toward her in the darkness. Her breath quickened as she swung her legs out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor. She crept toward the edge of the room, the silence pressing in on her. The house seemed to be holding its breath. "You have to help me," the voice whispered again, louder this time, and Emma felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just a voice. It was a plea, a desperate, tortured plea for help. Emma couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know what was causing the noise, what was beneath the floor. She grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crawled across the room to the corner where the sound seemed to be the loudest. The floorboards creaked as she knelt down, her hands trembling as she felt around the edges of the boards. The voice whispered again, "Please, help me." With a surge of adrenaline, Emma pried up a floorboard, the nails screeching in protest as she pulled it loose. A small gap opened up in the floor, just enough for her to peer down into the darkness beneath. At first, there was nothing, just the black void, the air thick with dust. But then, something stirred. A figure appeared from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but wrong, twisted, contorted, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its face was pale, gaunt, and its eyes were wide open, staring straight at her with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. It was watching her, waiting for her. The voice spoke again, this time directly from the hole in the floor. "Emma, you shouldn't have opened it." Emma recoiled, stumbling backward. She was paralyzed with fear, her hands gripping the sides of the bed as she stared at the hole in the floor. The thing below her was still watching, its unnaturally long fingers scraping against the wooden beams beneath the house. The same scraping sound she had heard all these nights. She turned to Josh, shaking him awake. "Josh, wake up. There's something in the floor." But Josh didn't respond. She shook him harder, but he remained unresponsive. It was as if he was in a deep sleep. No, deeper than sleep. She realized with horror that he wasn't just sleeping. He wasn't breathing. The thing in the floor spoke again, its voice a distorted growl this time, dragging itself through the darkness. "He's mine now." Emma felt her heart stop in her chest as she looked back at Josh. His eyes were open now, wide and vacant, his mouth slightly agape. The life had drained from his face, leaving him cold, lifeless. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps again, only this time, they weren't coming from beneath the floor. They were coming from behind her. The thing that waits. When Sarah moved into the house on Hollow Hill, she didn't expect much. She was just looking for a fresh start, away from the noise of the city and the broken relationships that had followed her there. The house was old, built on the edge of a forest, with windows that looked out onto nothing but the trees and the creeping fog. It was secluded, peaceful, perfect for someone like her. But something wasn't right from the start. It was small things at first, strange noises in the night, the feeling of being watched, the way the air always felt heavier in the basement. She tried to ignore it. Maybe it was the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place, or just her mind playing tricks on her. But when she first went down into the basement to check the furnace, that's when she felt it. A pull, a force that seemed to draw her deeper into the shadows beneath the house. At first, Sarah tried to stay away from the basement. She kept the door locked and the light off, telling herself that there was nothing down there worth her attention. But the dreams started. Horrible, vivid dreams of a dark, twisted figure in the basement, calling to her, begging her to come closer.